Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a world where the mere act of waking up would be an extreme sport. Imagine the crisp, frigid air biting at your exposed skin, not from an open window in your cozy room, but from a gaping hole in a drafty, smoke-filled longhouse. You rub the sleep from your eyes, only to find yourself not in your comfortable bed, but on a scratchy, straw-filled pallet beside a grunting pig and a snoring, heavily bearded Norseman who smells distinctly of fermented fish and something unidentifiable from the farmyard. The sounds around you are guttural, unfamiliar. A symphony of creaking wood, bleeding livestock, and the clanging of crude tools. This isn't a historical reenactment. This is your new reality. One wrong move, one missed beat, and you probably won't survive this. You're in a Viking village, and let me tell you, your modern sensibilities are about as useful here as a smartphone without Wi-Fi. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shiver, pulling the rough woolen blanket tighter around you, though it does little to ward off the pervasive chill. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, animal musk, and something vaguely metallic, a scent you'll soon associate with ironwork and, perhaps, dried blood. Your muscles ache in places you didn't even know you had muscles. A phantom pain that foreshadows the very real physical labor awaiting you. Looking around, you see figures already stirring, moving with a purpose born of generations of hard living. A woman is tending a small fire in the center of the longhouse, its smoke curling upwards towards an opening in the roof, battling valiantly against the pervasive dampness. Children, surprisingly robust for their small stature, are already scampering about, seemingly immune to the cold that penetrates your very bones. You try to speak, to ask where the nearest Starbucks is, but only a raspy croak escapes your throat. No one even glances your way. You are just another body, another mouth to feed, and in this world, if you're not contributing, you're a burden. The floor beneath you is hard-packed earth, uneven and cold. You gingerly push yourself up, your limbs protesting every movement. The longhouse itself is a marvel of sturdy, if rudimentary, construction, massive timber beams, a thatched roof that somehow keeps out most of the rain, and walls made of wattle and daub. It's dark, even with the small fire, and your eyes struggle to adjust to the perpetual twilight. There are no windows, not really, just narrow slits that let in slivers of weak light and blasts of even weaker air. You notice a few people are already outside, even before dawn, their silhouettes stark against the pre-morning sky. You can hear the distant bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, and the distinct sound of an axe splitting wood. There's no easing into the day here. The day simply hits you with the force of a Viking longship making landfall. Historians still argue whether these longhouses truly provided enough warmth in the depths of winter, or if the inhabitants simply developed an incredibly thick skin, literally and figuratively. One mainstream historical fact you'd quickly learn is that hygiene was optional. Many villages had very limited access to fresh, clean water for washing, and personal cleanliness. As we understand, it simply wasn't a priority. You might also notice a small, carved wooden idol tucked into a nook near the central hearth. This quirky tidbit highlights the deep, pervasive spiritual beliefs that permeated every aspect of Viking life, far beyond just grand sacrifices to Odin. You're not just dealing with physical discomfort. You're immersed in an entirely alien worldview. The idea of personal space is non-existent, and the constant proximity to animals and other humans would be a jarring sensory overload. Welcome to your new normal, where even breathing feels like a chore. As the first rays of a weak, watery sun pierce through the smoke hole, You realize your brief moment of bewildered inactivity is over. A gruff voice, speaking in a language that sounds like a series of guttural coughs and growls, barks something at you. You understand nothing, but the stern look and pointed finger towards a pile of axes leaning against the wall convey the message clearly enough. Time to work, Buttercup. This isn't a suggestion. It's a command. You pick up an axe, its rough wooden handle splintering slightly against your palm, and its head a heavy, unpolished chunk of iron. Feels unwieldy, dangerous, and you almost drop it on your foot. Your soft office worker hands, accustomed to keyboards and ergonomic mice, are already protesting the raw, calloused reality of Viking tools. Outside, the cold bites even harder. You're directed towards a stand of trees, not far from the village, where several other villagers are already hacking away with surprising efficiency. You watch one burly man split a log with a single powerful swing, the wood rending with a satisfying crack. You try to emulate him, raising the axe high, your muscles screaming in protest, and bring it down with a clumsy off-center blow. The axe bounces off the log with a pathetic thud, barely scratching the surface. The man beside you grunts, a sound that could be amusement or disgust, and takes the axe from your trembling hands. He shows you the proper grip, the way to let the weight of the axe do the work, the precise angle of the strike. It's a masterclass in efficiency, something you'd probably pay good money for in a modern survival course, but here it's just the basics. He hands it back, his expression daring you to fail again. The truth is, every single aspect of your day would be a relentless physical demand. There were no machines, no shortcuts. Everything from building and repairing structures to tending crops and animals, from forging tools to weaving cloth, was done by hand with muscle and sweat. Imagine needing new clothes. You'd be involved in every step. Shearing the sheep, cleaning the wool, which, by the way, involves a lot of gross stuff, carding it, spinning it into thread, and then weaving it on a loom that's probably as tall as you are. All before you even get to cutting and sewing. It's not just the big tasks either. Even fetching water from the well is a laborious affair, and there are no easy-fill pitchers or water filters. You haul buckets, heavy with icy water, back to the longhouse, spilling half of it on your poorly shod feet. One mainstream historical fact is that children, even young ones, were expected to contribute to the household labor from a very early age, often taking on tasks like fetching water, tending livestock, or helping with weaving. This highlights the collective effort required for survival. A quirky tidbit: some Viking axes were so beautifully crafted and balanced, they were considered works of art as much as tools or weapons. They were often passed down through generations, almost like family heirlooms, a stark contrast to the rough implement you're currently wrestling with. Historians still argue whether the physical prowess of the average Viking was due to natural selection or simply the unrelenting demands of their lifestyle. You look at your hands, already raw and blistered, and know for certain you're failing the physical exam. Your back aches, your shoulders burn, and it's not even midday. You miss your desk chair, your ergonomic keyboard, and the sweet relief of an air-conditioned office. The thought of a full day, let alone a lifetime, of this ceaseless toil is frankly terrifying. After a morning of battling an inanimate log and losing, you stumble back towards the longhouse, sweat trickling down your spine despite the cold. The thought of a refreshing shower, or even just a quick wash of your hands, is a cruel mirage. Your fellow villagers, however, seem blissfully unconcerned with personal aroma. You're starting to notice a certain pervasive funk that clings to everything and everyone. This is where your modern sensibilities truly begin to buckle. You might have read about it, but experiencing the reality of Viking hygiene, or lack thereof, is an entirely different beast. Let's just say the concept of a daily shower, or even weekly, simply didn't exist. Water was a precious commodity, especially clean, potable water. It was needed for drinking, for cooking, for brewing ale, and very little was spared for what we consider basic personal cleanliness. You'd be lucky to get a good scrub down once a month, perhaps in a communal bathhouse if the village was large enough and had the facilities. These bathhouses, often just a pit with heated stones and water poured over them to create steam, were more about ritual cleansing and warmth than germ eradication. Forget soap as you know it. They used lye or some form of ash to help cut through the grime, which probably did more to irritate your skin than clean it. And don't even think about shampoo or conditioner. Your hair would be a greasy, matted mess, a perfect habitat for lice and other delightful creatures. You try to surreptitiously scratch your head, already feeling a phantom itch that will soon become all too real. Then there's the matter of waste management. You won't find any flush toilets here. Human and animal waste would have been collected, perhaps in designated pits or simply allowed to accumulate in certain areas, to be eventually used as fertilizer for crops. This means flies, pervasive odors, and a constant low-level hum of disease-carrying insects. You might try to hold your breath as you walk past certain areas, but the smell, much like the cold, seems to penetrate everything. One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is that Vikings actually had combs, often made of bone or antler, and used them regularly, not just for styling, but for delousing their hair. It was a practical necessity, a constant battle against the tiny invaders. A quirky tidbit. Some evidence suggests that wealthy Vikings, particularly women, sometimes used small tweezers or razors for personal grooming, hinting at a desire for cleanliness beyond mere survival, though this was certainly not the norm for the average villager. Historians still argue whether the apparent hardiness of the Viking immune system was a result of constant exposure to pathogens from birth, or simply a testament to the grim reality that only the most resilient survive childhood. You look at your hands, still dirty from handling the axe, and the thought of eating with them makes your stomach churn. You try to remember the last time you saw someone wash their hands before handling food. You can't. The thought of ingesting something unsavory is a constant, nagging worry at the back of your mind. Forget subtle body sprays or fresh breath mints. Your primary concern would be simply not smelling too offensive to your fellow villagers, and honestly, even that might be an uphill battle. The aroma of a Viking longhouse at the end of a long day would be an experience in itself. A pungent blend of body odor, smoke, animal dung, and whatever tonight's stew happens to be brewing. You suppress a gag, realizing this is just the beginning of your sensory challenges. As if the constant cold, endless toil, and questionable hygiene weren't enough, you're now acutely aware of the unseen threats that lurk everywhere: disease and danger. In your cozy modern life, a cut finger means a quick antiseptic wipe and a band-aid. Here, it could mean the loss of a limb or worse, your life. You've already managed to nick yourself with the axe. Don't ask how. And the small cut on your thumb, barely a pinprick by your standards, already looks angry and red. There's no neosporin, no tetanus shot, no emergency room. The best you can hope for is someone to chew on some herbs and spit them on your wound, or maybe wrap it in a spider web, if you're lucky. Every cough from a fellow villager sends a shiver down your spine that has nothing to do with the cold. Common colds can quickly escalate into pneumonia, a death sentence in a world without antibiotics. Childhood diseases like measles or mumps, easily managed today, would sweep through a village with devastating effect, claiming the lives of many young ones. Even a simple toothache, something you'd pop a couple of ibuprofen for, could become a raging infection, leading to sepsis and a painful, drawn-out demise. You can already feel a dull throb in one of your molars, and you try not to think about it. Beyond illness, physical danger is a constant companion. Farming tools are sharp, animals are unpredictable, and the environment itself is unforgiving. A slip on icy terrain, a fall from a roof during repairs, or a misstep during a hunt could result in broken bones. There are no X-rays, no casts, no physical therapy. A compound fracture would likely mean amputation, performed with a rusty saw and a swig of ale for anesthetic. If you survived the initial agony, you'd then face the very real threat of infection in the aftermath. One mainstream historical fact is that average life expectancy in the Viking Age was significantly lower than today, often cited as being in the 30s or 40s, largely due to high infant mortality rates, disease, and injury. A quirky tidbit that might make you wince. Historical evidence suggests that some Viking healers used cauterization, burning the wound, to stop bleeding or seal off infections. A truly brutal, if sometimes effective, method. Imagine that happening to your cut thumb. Historians still argue whether the Vikings had any truly effective herbal remedies beyond those with basic anti-inflammatory or pain-relieving properties, or if their medicine was mostly superstition and desperate measures. You find yourself constantly scanning your surroundings, not for danger in the modern sense, but for hazards that could easily cripple or kill you. That loose stone on the path, the slightly rotted step leading into the longhouse, the wild-eyed look in that pig's eye, everything suddenly seems like a potential threat. You realize how utterly dependent you are on modern medical advancements, and how terrifyingly vulnerable you are without them. The idea of living your entire life under such a constant cloud of vulnerability is enough to make you long for the sterile, predictable safety of a doctor's waiting room. You probably wouldn't last a day, not just physically, but mentally, under this relentless pressure of impending doom. Your stomach, accustomed to 3 square meals and endless snacks, is now making noises that sound like a dying walrus. You've been working all morning, and the thought of food is all that's keeping you going. Finally, a signal to gather, and your hopes soar. Perhaps a feast? A succulent roasted boar? Perhaps? You quickly learn that your modern ideas of dining are as out of place here as a microwave oven. The meal, when it arrives, is functional. You're handed a wooden bowl containing a grayish, thick porridge, likely made from oats or barley, possibly with some dried fish bits stirred in. It's bland, coarse, and while it fills your stomach, it offers little in the way of culinary delight. There's no cutlery, just your fingers and perhaps a small, dull knife if you're lucky enough to own one. You watch others eat with practiced efficiency, shoveling the gruel into their mouths, their faces devoid of any particular enjoyment, simply focused on nourishment. This is not dining, it's fueling. Meat, if it's available, is usually dried, smoked, or salted to preserve it. Fresh meat is a rare treat, reserved for special occasions or after a successful hunt. You might get a bit of mutton, tough and stringy, or perhaps some fish, equally tough and tasting overwhelmingly of salt. Vegetables are seasonal and limited, mostly root vegetables like carrots or parsnips, or wild greens gathered from the surrounding lands. Fruits are even rarer, perhaps a few berries in the summer, but certainly not the year-round bounty you're used to. Forget about spices, sugar, or anything beyond the most basic seasoning. Your palate, used to a global smorgasbord of flavors, would be in a state of perpetual shock and disappointment. You'd also discover the concept of variety in meals is pretty much non-existent. You'd eat the same few things day in and day out for weeks, possibly months, until the seasons changed or a new harvest came in. One mainstream historical fact is that dairy products, particularly fermented ones like skyr, a type of yogurt or cheese, were a staple of the Viking diet, providing essential protein and fat, especially when meat was scarce. A quirky tidbit: some evidence suggests Vikings sometimes added things like tree bark or moss to their bread or porridge during times of famine to extend their meager food supplies, which really puts your low-carb diet into perspective, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the Viking diet, despite its apparent monotony, was nutritionally complete enough to support their demanding physical lifestyle, or if they suffered from various nutrient deficiencies that contributed to their shorter lifespans. You try to imagine going without your morning coffee, your afternoon chocolate, or your favorite takeout meal. The thought alone sends shivers down your spine. Your metabolism, trained by years of readily available calories, would be constantly craving energy, and your taste buds would stage a full-scale rebellion. You'd probably lose a significant amount of weight, but you wouldn't be celebrating your new physique. You'd be desperately trying to avoid starvation. This brutal, monotonous diet wouldn't just be a challenge for your stomach. It would be a constant, grinding assault on your morale. As you finish your uninspiring meal, the biting cold reasserts itself. You realize you've been so focused on the food, or lack thereof, that you almost forgot the pervasive chill that never truly leaves you. This isn't just a nippy autumn day. This is a harsh climate, a relentless adversary that demands constant vigilance and respect. You're bundled in layers of coarse wool and animal skins, yet the cold still seeps into your bones, a constant dull ache in your fingers and toes. Winter in the Norse lands would be an experience in sheer survival. Days are short, barely a flicker of pale sunlight, and nights are long, stretching into endless hours of darkness punctuated by the howl of the wind. Snow drifts pile high, often trapping villagers indoors for days on end. The longhouse, despite the central fire, offers only marginal warmth, and the smoke, while providing some insulation, also makes breathing a continuous effort. You find yourself constantly shivering, your body expending precious energy just to maintain core temperature. Your modern thermostat-regulated comfort is a distant, almost unbelievable memory. You'd miss central heating more than you miss your phone. Even in summer, the weather is unpredictable. While there might be periods of glorious sunshine, sudden, fierce storms can roll in from the sea, bringing torrential rain and strong winds that can flatten crops or even damage dwellings. You'd quickly learn to read the sky, to feel the subtle shifts in the wind, because your very life and the life of your community depended on it. A bad harvest due to an unexpected frost or a prolonged drought meant starvation, pure and simple. There was no importing food from warmer climates, no global supply chains to bail you out. One mainstream historical fact is that the Vikings were incredibly skilled shipbuilders, designing their longships to be robust enough to withstand the ferocious storms of the North Atlantic, a testament to their constant battle with the elements. A quirky tidbit: some sagas mention Vikings carrying sunstones, possibly Icelandic spar, to help them navigate on cloudy days or after sunset, hinting at a desperate need to overcome the limitations imposed by the harsh, often light-deprived environment. Historians still argue whether the extreme weather conditions fostered a more resilient and adaptable people, or simply weeded out those who weren't born with an inherent toughness for survival. You glance at the small, narrow slits that serve as windows in the longhouse, realizing they're not for enjoying the view. They're designed to minimize heat loss and prevent drafts. Every architectural choice, every daily routine, every garment worn, is a direct response to the brutal reality of the climate. You try to imagine enduring months of perpetual twilight, biting winds, and the constant threat of freezing, and you know with a chilling certainty that your spirit, let alone your body, would crumble under the relentless pressure of such an unforgiving environment. With your stomach grudgingly satisfied and the biting cold still very much present, your attention shifts to the people around you. You've noticed the unspoken rules, the way some individuals defer to others, the quiet authority in certain gazes. This isn't a democracy, not by a long shot. You are immersed in a rigid social order, a complex web of hierarchies and expectations that would be utterly alien to your modern egalitarian sensibilities. At the top, of course, is the Jarl or the chieftain, the local leader. His word is law, and his authority is often backed by force, land, and loyalty from his retainers. You'd quickly learn to show extreme deference to such figures, avoiding eye contact unless directly addressed, and always speaking with respect. Then there are the carls, the freemen, like the men you saw chopping wood this morning. These are the farmers, craftsmen, and warriors who form the backbone of the community. They own land, they have rights, and they participate in the local assemblies, the things where disputes are settled and laws are upheld. You, my friend, would likely fall into this category if you were lucky enough to be accepted into the community at all. Your survival would depend on your ability to prove your worth as a productive member. Below the freemen are the thralls, the slaves. These were often captives from raids or people who had fallen into debt. Their lives were brutal, short, and they had virtually no rights. They performed the most arduous and demeaning tasks, subject to the whims of their owners. The thought of being a thrall would send shivers down your spine, not just from the physical torment but the utter lack of agency. You might see a thrall being bought or sold as easily as livestock, a grim reminder of the value placed on human life in this age. Women, while often excluded from formal political power, held significant influence within the household and community. They managed the domestic sphere, controlled the household keys, a symbol of their authority, and were often responsible for the family's wealth when the men were away. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking women had more rights than many of their counterparts in other contemporary European societies, including the right to own land, divorce their husbands, and even reclaim their dowry. This often surprises people who envision Viking society as purely patriarchal. A quirky tidbit: some archaeological evidence suggests certain women were buried with symbols of authority, like keys or even weapons, sparking debate about whether some women held leadership roles beyond the domestic sphere, perhaps even as shield maidens. Historians still argue whether the apparent freedom of Viking women was a reflection of genuine gender equality or simply a practical necessity in a society where men were often absent for long periods on raids or trade journeys. You'd quickly learn that every interaction, every gesture, carried unspoken weight. Offending someone of higher status could have severe consequences, and disrespecting a freeman could lead to a blood feud, a concept far removed from your modern idea of a polite disagreement. Your attempts at casual banter or ironic wit would likely be met with blank stares, or worse, outright hostility. Having navigated the murky waters of Viking social hierarchy, you're now confronted with another uncomfortable truth: the legal labyrinth, or rather, the stark, often brutal, reality of Viking justice. Forget plea bargains, jury trials, or appeals processes. Here, justice is swift, often public, and frequently violent. You quickly learn that even minor transgressions can have severe consequences, and an insult, a perceived slight, could escalate into a deadly feud. Let's imagine you accidentally damage someone's property, perhaps by letting your borrowed axe slip and gouge a chunk out of their prized wooden cart. In your world, you'd offer to pay for the damage, maybe apologize profusely, and that would be that. Here, the injured party might demand compensation, known as wergild, for injuries or property damage, or they might demand satisfaction through a challenge. Disputes were typically settled at the local thing, a public assembly of freemen where grievances were aired and judgments were made. There's no fancy courtroom, no lawyers arguing complex points of law. Instead, it's a gathering of the community, where testimonies are given, oaths are sworn, and consensus is reached, often with the local jarl or a respected elder presiding. However, the legal system was deeply rooted in concepts of honor and family. If a dispute couldn't be resolved peacefully, or if a serious crime like murder occurred, it could lead to a blood feud. This meant that the victim's family had the right, and even the duty, to seek vengeance against the perpetrator or their family. This wasn't a one-off event. Feuds could drag on for generations, with cycles of retaliatory killings that devastated families and communities. You might accidentally step on someone's foot, and suddenly you're embroiled in a multi-generational vendetta, because their great-great-grandfather was wronged by someone who looked vaguely like you. Okay, maybe not that extreme, but you get the idea. The potential for misunderstandings to explode into violence is terrifyingly high. One mainstream historical fact is that the Norse legal system, while seemingly harsh, placed a strong emphasis on oaths and public testimony, often involving the swearing of solemn vows on sacred rings or objects to prove one's innocence or truthfulness. A quirky tidbit. Some sagas describe instances where disputes were settled through holmgang, a formal duel fought on a small island or piece of cloth, where one party could challenge another to combat to settle a disagreement, though this practice was eventually outlawed in many areas. Historians still argue whether the apparent brutality of Viking justice was a reflection of a fundamentally savage society, or a necessary mechanism for maintaining order in communities with limited centralized authority and policing. You realize that your ingrained sense of fairness and due process means nothing here. Justice is personal, immediate, and often decided by strength, reputation, or sheer stubbornness. The thought of being accused of something, with no real way to defend yourself beyond your word and potentially your sword, is a chilling prospect. You'd have to constantly monitor your words and actions, lest you inadvertently trigger a chain of events that leads to someone wanting your head on a pike. And remember that cut on your thumb? If it got infected and you couldn't work, someone might decide you're not pulling your weight and have you outcast, a fate possibly worse than death. As the sun begins its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple, you notice a shift in the village atmosphere. The clang of hammers and axes fades, replaced by the murmur of voices and the crackle of hearth fires. But this quiet doesn't bring peace. It brings a different kind of intensity. You sense a palpable connection to something ancient, something unseen, woven into the very fabric of their lives. You are now confronting the profound influence of Norse paganism, a world where gods walked among men, spirits inhabited the land, and destiny was an unshakable force. Unlike your modern world, where religion might be a private belief or a Sunday morning activity, here it is omnipresent. Every sunrise, every harvest, every birth, every death, every journey, all are imbued with spiritual significance. You'd witness offerings made to the gods, perhaps a small sacrifice of ale or a portion of a meal, poured onto the ground or left at a carved idol. You might see villagers wearing Thor's hammers as amulets, not just as jewelry, but as protective charms. The trees, the rivers, the very stones around you would be seen as potentially inhabited by spirits, whether benevolent wights or mischievous Vaetir, demanding respect and propitiation. The Norse pantheon is not about singular, omnipotent deities. It's a vibrant, often chaotic family of gods and goddesses, each with their own domain and personality. There's Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and death. Thor, the mighty protector, wielder of Mjolnir. Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and war, and many others. Their stories, the sagas and eddas, are not just myths. They are histories, moral lessons, and explanations for the workings of the world. You'd hear these tales spun around the fire at night, not as bedtime stories, but as living narratives that shaped their understanding of fate and honor. One mainstream historical fact is that the Vikings believed in Valhalla, a magnificent hall in Asgard where slain warriors, chosen by the Valkyries, feasted with Odin until Ragnarok, the final battle. This belief often motivated their courage and fearlessness in combat. A quirky tidbit: archaeological finds have unearthed small, intricately carved wooden or stone figures, often interpreted as household gods or protective spirits, suggesting a very personal and intimate relationship with the divine beyond the grand sacrifices at temples. Historians still argue whether the conversion to Christianity was a slow, gradual process driven by trade and political alliances, or more forcefully imposed through the influence of powerful Christian kings and missionaries. You'd find your modern, often skeptical worldview completely at odds with this deeply spiritual reality. Your attempts to apply logic or scientific reasoning to explain natural phenomena would be met with confusion, perhaps even suspicion. If the crops failed, it wasn't poor soil or bad weather. It was the gods expressing their displeasure, or a malevolent spirit meddling. Your rational mind would struggle to comprehend a world where omens were read in the flight of birds, and the cries of a raven could dictate the success or failure of a raid. The constant awareness of unseen forces, of fate or log, being an unavoidable path, would be both humbling and terrifying. Just as you begin to adjust to the pervasive influence of the gods, a sudden, jarring sound shatters the evening quiet. A distant horn, sharp and urgent, followed by shouts. Your stomach lurches. This is it. This is the constant conflict that defines so much of the Viking Age, the ever-present possibility of raids and inter-village feuds. You'd quickly learn that peace was a temporary state, and danger lurked not just in the wilderness, but in the next longship pulling into your fjord. Panic claws at your throat. Your mind races. Where's the safest place? Do you run? Do you hide? You look around, and to your astonishment, the other villagers, while clearly on edge, are moving with a chilling efficiency. Men are grabbing axes, spears, and shields. Women are herding children not into hiding, but towards designated, safer parts of the longhouse or defensive positions. There's a grim determination on their faces, born of countless similar alarms. This isn't their first rodeo, and you, frankly, are a complete amateur. The raid might be from a rival village seeking land or retribution for a past grievance. It could be from opportunistic bandits, or even a larger force from a neighboring kingdom. The motives vary, but the outcome is often the same: violence, plunder, and potentially death or enslavement. You'd quickly realize that your modern concept of law enforcement or national defense simply doesn't exist in the same way. Protection is communal, reliant on the strength and readiness of your own village. There are number 911 calls. No police sirens screaming in the distance. Just the sound of steel on steel and the screams of those caught in the fray. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking raids were not always about large-scale invasions. They were often small, opportunistic attacks on isolated settlements, monasteries, or farms, making virtually any coastal or riverside community vulnerable. A quirky tidbit: some sagas describe elaborate alarm systems, such as signal fires or specific horn blasts, used to alert nearby villages of impending attacks, showing a degree of organized defense beyond simple individual bravery. Historians still argue whether the frequency and brutality of Viking raids were primarily driven by economic necessity, a warrior culture valuing plunder and glory, or simply a reflection of the tumultuous political landscape of early medieval Europe. You fumble for something, anything, to defend yourself, but all you have is the blunt axe you struggled with this morning. You're not a warrior. You're barely competent with a tool, let alone a weapon designed for combat. The idea of standing shoulder to shoulder with these battle-hardened individuals, facing down an armed attacker, makes your blood run cold. Your instinct is to flee, to find cover, to avoid conflict at all costs. Their instinct is to stand their ground, to protect their home and kin, or to launch a counterattack. The sheer cultural mismatch in the face of direct violence would paralyze you. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're a coward, but because your entire upbringing has programmed you to avoid the very situations that these people live and breathe. The shouts and the horn fade into a tense silence, a reprieve, for now. You slump against a wall, your heart pounding a frantic rhythm against your ribs. You just witnessed, firsthand, the chilling reality of constant conflict. And that brings you to another stark realization: your utter lack of skill and appropriate gear for combat. You've seen the villagers pick up their weapons with ease, their movements fluid and practiced. You, on the other hand, barely know which end of a sword is which. Imagine being handed a heavy, double-edged sword. It's not the gleaming, perfectly balanced prop from a fantasy movie. It's a functional, somewhat crudely forged piece of iron, heavy and unbalanced in your untrained grip. You try to swing it, and it feels like you're wrestling with a small tree. There are no fencing lessons, no YouTube tutorials on advanced swordplay. Your only instruction would be through grueling, repetitive practice under the watchful, impatient eyes of seasoned warriors. You'd probably slice your own ear off before you even touched an opponent. Then there's the shield. Not a lightweight, decorative piece, but a thick, wooden disc, often reinforced with leather and an iron boss in the center. It's meant to absorb blows, to deflect axes and spears, and it's surprisingly heavy. Trying to hold it steady, to move with it defensively while also attempting to wield a weapon, would feel like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach while riding a unicycle. Your arms would ache within minutes, and your guard would drop, leaving you fatally exposed. And what about armor? You'd be lucky to have a padded leather tunic, perhaps a simple iron helmet if you were a particularly wealthy or skilled warrior. Forget full-plate armor. That's centuries in the future. Most warriors would rely on their shield, their skill, and sheer luck. A well-placed blow from an axe or a spear, and your relatively soft, modern body would offer little resistance. One mainstream historical fact is that the iconic Viking helmet, often depicted with horns, is largely a modern invention. Actual Viking helmets were typically simple, conical, or Spangenhelm style, designed for practical protection. A quirky tidbit: some archaeological finds suggest that skilled Viking bowmen sometimes used specially designed arrowheads that were intended to pierce mail armor, indicating a sophisticated understanding of contemporary defensive technologies. Historians still argue whether the Viking warriors' primary strength lay in individual prowess and ferocity, or in their disciplined use of formations like the shield wall. You watch the villagers, even the older ones, handling their weapons with an innate familiarity, an extension of their very being. For them, these tools are not just instruments of war. They are instruments of survival, integral to their identity and their way of life. You realize with a shudder that in a world where violence is so common, your inability to defend yourself would make you a liability, a weakness that could endanger not only yourself but those around you. You'd be the first one to fall, and your body, far from being a monument, would simply be another unfortunate casualty of a brutal, unforgiving age. You've survived the threat of a raid, for now, and realized your utter inadequacy in combat. But the danger isn't always from external foes. Sometimes, it's from the sheer difficulty of creating the very items necessary for survival. You'd quickly discover that your skill set, honed for a world of instant gratification and mass production, is utterly useless when it comes to the daily crafting ordeal. Imagine needing a simple wooden spoon. In your world, you click a button, and it arrives at your door. Here, you'd need to find the right piece of wood, fell the tree yourself, remember that axe, then painstakingly carve it using rudimentary tools, a small axe, a knife, and perhaps a gouge. It would take hours, maybe days, of painstaking work, and your first attempt would probably look more like a splintered club than a utensil. And that's just a spoon. Now scale that up. Need new clothes? You're not just buying a t-shirt. You're shearing the sheep, washing the wool, remember the lack of good hygiene? Carding it, spinning it into thread on a drop spindle, and then weaving it on a loom that is, frankly, a complicated piece of machinery. The process is slow, tedious, and requires immense patience and skill. Every garment, every blanket, every piece of rope is the result of countless hours of labor. There's no fast fashion here. There's only durable, hard-won necessity. Even something as basic as a nail is a monumental task. There are no factories churning out fasteners. Every single nail, every hinge, every piece of metalwork has to be forged by hand, by a blacksmith, in a laborious process involving heating metal in a roaring furnace, hammering it into shape, cooling it, and repeating the process until the desired form is achieved. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer is a constant, rhythmic soundtrack to village life, a testament to the sheer effort involved in creating even the simplest metal objects. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking artisans were highly skilled, particularly in metalwork, creating intricate jewelry, weapons, and tools, often using complex techniques like pattern welding for swords. A quirky tidbit: some evidence suggests Vikings might have used early forms of lathes, operated by foot power, to turn wood for bowls and other round objects, showcasing an ingenious approach to simplifying some crafting tasks. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' impressive craftsmanship, especially in shipbuilding and intricate carvings, was driven by a practical need for durable goods or by an inherent artistic sensibility. You'd watch a craftsman at work, perhaps a leatherworker tanning hides, a truly smelly process, by the way, involving urine and animal brains, told you hygiene was optional, or a carpenter shaping planks and feel utterly useless. Your hands, accustomed to swiping screens and typing, would be clumsy and weak. The satisfaction they get from creating something tangible, something essential, from raw materials, would be completely alien to you. You'd be a consumer in a world of producers, and your inability to contribute to the creation of basic necessities would mark you as a drain on resources, a burden, a mouth that consumes but does not produce. You'd probably break more than you made, and that, in a world of scarcity, is a luxury no one can afford. Having struggled with the brutal realities of daily life, from the cold to the crafting, you now turn your gaze to the smallest members of the community, and another harsh truth settles in: the extreme hardship of childhood in a Viking village. Forget playdates, educational toys, or helicopter parenting. Here, childhood is a brief, intense apprenticeship for survival, and many don't even make it past their earliest years. You see children everywhere, but they are not merely playing. Even the smallest ones are engaged in purposeful activity. A young girl, barely old enough to walk steadily, is gathering twigs for the fire. A boy, no older than 7 or 8, is tasked with tending the goats, his small hands already calloused. Play, when it happens, is often a mimicry of adult tasks. Children might whittle miniature axes, practice throwing small spears, or herd imaginary livestock. Their games are rehearsals for the roles they will soon inhabit, not just entertainment. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure to the elements meant that many children never saw their first birthday, let alone their 5th. You might witness a family mourning the loss of a child with a quiet stoicism that chills you to the bone, a grim acceptance of fate in a world where life was fragile. There's no extensive medical care, no specialized pediatricians. If a child fell ill, their survival was largely a matter of their own resilience and the effectiveness of traditional, often rudimentary remedies. Formal education, as you know it, is non-existent. There are no schools, no textbooks, no standardized tests. Instead, children learn through observation, imitation, and direct instruction from their parents and older villagers. Boys would learn farming, hunting, fishing, and rudimentary combat skills from their fathers and male relatives. Girls would learn weaving, cooking, food preservation, and household management from their mothers and female elders. It's an immersive, hands-on education, driven by necessity. One mainstream historical fact is that sagas and archaeological finds indicate children were given small, functional tools or weapons from a young age, preparing them early for their adult responsibilities. A quirky tidbit: Some evidence suggests that Viking children played with carved wooden toys, including miniature ships and animals, offering a rare glimpse into moments of childhood innocence amidst the hardship. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism of Viking parents in the face of child mortality was a coping mechanism born of constant loss, or a reflection of a different emotional landscape where children were viewed more as future contributors to the community than as fragile individuals. You try to imagine your own pampered childhood, filled with cartoons and sugary cereal, in this environment. The thought of your younger self being forced to contribute to the daily grind, facing constant threats of illness and injury, is a sobering one. You'd likely be seen as soft, weak, and utterly unprepared for the rigors of growing up in a Viking village. The expectations placed upon even the youngest members of this society are immense, forging a resilience that your modern upbringing simply cannot replicate. You've seen the brutal realities of childhood, and now your gaze drifts to the older members of the village. The sight of them reveals yet another challenging facet of Viking life, the limited options and often grim eventual fate of the aged. Your modern world reveres youth, but here, the elderly, while respected for their wisdom and experience, also face a stark reality of declining physical capability in a society that demands constant contribution. There's an old woman by the fire, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands gnarled by a lifetime of labor. She moves slowly, her joints creaking, but she's still spinning wool, her fingers working with a practiced rhythm. Nearby, an older man, his back bent, is mending a fishing net, his eyes weak but still sharp enough for the task. They are still contributing, still pulling their weight. This is key. In a subsistence society, there's no concept of retirement benefits or nursing homes. If you can no longer contribute meaningfully to the community's labor, your options become increasingly limited. Respect for elders was certainly present, especially for those who held knowledge, remembered sagas, or offered counsel. Their wisdom regarding farming cycles, healing herbs, or the ways of the gods would be highly valued. However, this respect was often tied to their ongoing utility. As physical strength diminished, their roles would shift to less strenuous tasks: storytelling, childcare, mending, or advising. But if they became too frail, too much of a burden, the situation became precarious. There are no social safety nets here, no pensions, no government-funded health care. Families were responsible for their aged members, and while filial piety was strong, the brutal realities of scarce resources sometimes led to difficult choices. It's a harsh thought, but if a severe winter hit and food became desperately scarce, those who could no longer contribute might be the first to face starvation. There's a certain grim pragmatism that underpins survival in this environment. One mainstream historical fact is that while some elders were revered for their wisdom and became respected advisors, the physically demanding nature of Viking society meant that living to a very old age was rare, and those who did often continued to contribute in some capacity. A quirky tidbit: some sagas contain instances of exposure, where the elderly or infirm might choose or be encouraged to go out into the wilderness to die, a practice that, while rare and highly controversial among historians, points to the desperate circumstances some faced. Historians still argue whether such practices were driven purely by economic necessity and survival, or if they were also influenced by a cultural acceptance of death and the cycle of life. You look at your own projected future, filled with leisurely retirement and comfortable aging, and compare it to the stoic resilience of these elders. The idea of your body giving out, but your mind still being expected to be sharp and useful, or worse, becoming a burden on your family, is a truly terrifying thought. Your modern fear of aging is primarily about losing comfort or independence. Their fear was about losing the ability to survive, or worse, becoming a drain on the community that might lead to an unimaginable fate. You've endured the cold, the work, the stench, the constant threat of disease, the monotonous food, the rigid social order, the brutal justice, the pervasive spirituality, the ever-present conflict, your own combat inadequacy, the endless crafting, and the grim realities of childhood and aging. Now, as the day draws to a close and the longhouse settles into a noisy, communal quiet, you face the final, perhaps most insurmountable, obstacle. The profound mindset mismatch that would break you. Your entire life has been shaped by concepts utterly alien to this world. You value individual choice, personal freedom, privacy, comfort, and the pursuit of happiness. Here, the collective good of the clan or village takes precedence over individual desires. Your ideas of personal space would be laughable. You live, eat, and sleep in close quarters with dozens of others, human and animal. Your emphasis on hygiene and sanitation would be seen as eccentric, if not outright wasteful. Your need for constant stimulation, for entertainment, for varied experiences, would go completely unfulfilled. There are no screens, no music streaming, no endless sources of novelty. Life is repetitive, predictable in its hardships, and focused purely on survival. You'd struggle with the fatalism inherent in Norse belief, the concept of orlog or destiny. While they prized courage and action, there was also an acceptance that certain things were simply fated, beyond human control. This contrasts sharply with your modern belief in self-determination and the idea that you can shape your own destiny. Imagine trying to explain your career aspirations, your desire for personal growth, or your mental health struggles to people whose primary goal is simply to make it through the winter without starving or being raided. They'd look at you with utter bewilderment. The sheer stoicism and resilience of these people would highlight your own perceived fragility. They endure pain, loss, and hardship with a grim determination that you, conditioned by a society that strives to eliminate discomfort, simply cannot fathom. Your emotional responses, your expressions of fear or frustration, would likely be met with blank stares or a dismissive grunt. There's no room for fragility, no time for introspection in a world where immediate threats demand immediate action. One mainstream historical fact is that personal honor and reputation, known as drap and havemal, were incredibly important in Viking society, often more so than material wealth, and insults could lead to severe consequences, highlighting a profoundly different value system. A quirky tidbit: despite their fierce reputation, evidence suggests Vikings also enjoyed board games like Nefadafel, a strategic game, revealing a capacity for intellectual pursuits and leisure beyond pure physicality. Historians still argue whether the Norse sagas accurately reflect the everyday psychological realities of Viking life, or if they present a somewhat idealized, heroic version of their mindset. You realize that even if you somehow manage to survive the physical challenges, the sheer mental and emotional toll of living in a world so fundamentally different from your own would be crushing. The constant anxiety, the lack of familiar comforts, the alien social norms, the brutal indifference of nature, and the ever-present threat of violence would strip away your modern identity piece by piece until there was nothing left but a shell of your former self. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak, but because you're a product of a different age, a different world, and your mind, more than your body, would simply give up under the weight of such an unimaginable existence. The sounds of the longhouse begin to soften, the crackling fire a gentle lullaby. The cold, though still present, feels less biting as warmth slowly spreads from the embers. The harsh scents of smoke and animals begin to blend into a singular, earthy aroma, strangely comforting in its familiarity. You close your eyes, the last vivid images of the Viking village fading into the soft edges of your mind. The sounds of distant bleating and the gentle whisper of the wind outside the thatched roof become part of the calming quiet. Your bed, wherever you are, feels impossibly soft and warm. The air around you is clean, familiar, safe. The worries of the Viking age recede, becoming just echoes in the vast halls of history. Rest now. Your journey through the past is complete, and the present awaits you with its comforts and quietude. Let the images drift, softening into the peaceful darkness of your dreams. Sleep well,